course, to the two presenters, Stefan Josephs, who's Head of Business Development, and Vickers Furstenberg, the Head of the Interest Rate Process, and to tell us about the state of South African public finances and what are we going to do to close, how close are we to a debt trap. I'm going to hand over to Stefan, who will then hand over to Vickers. But please, just some housekeeping rules, please ensure that your microphones are muted. But from me, I'll chat with you at the end. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Artemis. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And yeah, welcome everybody. Good morning. I think this is, in my memory, the second time that Futuregrowth is hosting in partnership with ACTSA. And I think, yeah, this morning we're talking about a very important subject that affects not both of us, but all of us in South Africa. It affects all households. And the question is around the state of public finances in South Africa. And you know, as Artemis pointed out, we asked the question, how close are we to a debt trap? Or are we in a de facto debt trap already? And the most common definition about a debt trap that we reach for is when you have to make a loan to pay off the servicing cost of your debt, so to pay off the interest on your debt. So your capital is not reducing, but you're making a loan that also accrues interest to pay off, to service that interest that is accruing on the previous loans that you make. So if you think about that just in your own household, you know, that vicious cycle that can develop as a result of being in such a state, it's not a good space to be in. And the question is, well, you know, as a household, what do I need to do to get out of that debt trap? And, you know, we then expand that into the South African economy, and we ask, well, you know, what do we need to do from a government perspective, from an economic perspective, to get out of that debt trap? So Vickers will be doing most of the presentation this morning. He's got a couple of slides and a couple of data points that he wants to share with us. And then there'll be a question and answer session at the end. If you have any burning questions that comes up, make use of the chat box or the text box on the side, and we will then answer those questions at the end of the presentation. For those of the audience that's joining us and maybe don't know too much about Futuregrowth, those are just some of the salient features of our company that you got on the screen there. Specialist fixed income house, I'm not going to run through all of them, but anything to do with an interest rate is where we get involved. We've got about 180 billion rand of assets under management, and part of that 180 billion rand of assets that we have, part of that is a solution that speaks to treasury management type of investment strategies. So it's a fund that we have that offers a better yield relative to what treasuries would earn, having their money in the bank. So there'll be some contact details of mine at the end of the presentation should you wish to reach out and maybe have a conversation around that. So I'm not going to make them in a long song and dance. I'm going to hand over to Vickers, who's going to run us through the presentation. And as I said, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and then we'll chat about it at the end of the presentation. But thanks again for the opportunity, and we hope that you find value in this morning's presentation. Over to you, Vickers.
Thank you very much, Stefan. We have 25 minutes this morning. I've got 11 slides, and it's based on an article that the team wrote and published in August. And as you would expect, all of us to do when we do research is to look for good reference material as well, just to sort of have that in the background as well. And the team stumbled upon the South African Reserve Bank paper written in 1993. I think some of you are probably still at school, titled, "Is South Africa in a Debt Trap?" Now, a few months ago, reading that paper raised striking similarities between the public finance debate at the time and the debate raging today, even though the backdrop could hardly have been more different. I mean, looking back, I think very few, if any, analysts at the time, including myself, mind you, expected the fairy tale developers that followed about a decade into the new dispensation. Then government not only managed to avoid the proverbial fiscal cliff, but they actually generated small budget surpluses, which enabled a significant reduction of the public sector debt load at the time. Of course, we have to remember that the fledgling democracy benefited from a number of strong tailwinds at the time, including a very strong global economy. Remember the good old days when the Chinese economy grew at a rate of 10% plus, and none of us believed those numbers. But equally important, though, and I think that is critical to sort of keep those in mind, was the role that prudent, sound fiscal management in South Africa played at the time. Many good examples of that, and our own sort of in-house fiscal strength indicator clearly reflects the healthy fiscal situation at the time. And, you know, going through all this, keep in mind, we just want to look at numbers. We don't have any sort of like issues with the people at National Treasury or elsewhere are really doing a sterling job. It's about the big picture. It's about getting things right. So where are we today? Could we face a similar surprise in the next 5 to 10 years? Or South Africa already at the point of no return due to this unsustainable or an unsustainable public sector debt burden? So I'm going to use a few slides to try and unpack that, and I'm happy to take questions as Stephen indicated. So your first slide would be clearly, you know, checking out what's happening to South African economic growth using GDP year-on-year change going back to 1994. And I think for us now, let's ignore what happened, you know, earlier this year. We know it was COVID-19 related. Want to focus on, I mean, are the longer term trends. Going back 10 years, just before the outbreak of the global financial crisis, GDP growth in SA sort of averaged just below 4%. Awesome. At the time, I think we complained because we wanted growth to be closer to 5-6%. Of course, we needed to. And again, as I mentioned right at the beginning, strong tailwinds that supported us, no doubt about that. But as I also indicated, great sort of macro management at the time from government side. Then we had the crisis, and since then, you know, it just went one way and went south. I mean, for the 10 years ending, you know, the last 10 years, growth averaged around, you know, just below 2%. Clearly not good enough, and it's going to be even worse, you know, with us expecting growth, like all of you probably, to average around minus 8, minus 10% for this year. So why is this important? Well, I think it goes without saying that, you know, government needs a strong economy because the correlation between tax revenue collection and real GDP growth is high, is over 60%. Of course, there are other sort of drivers as well, tax efficiency gains, etc., etc. But in the end, if economic growth falters, then clearly tax collection will suffer. And we sort of had clear evidence of that the last few years. Again, I want to repeat it. There are other drivers as well. I know tax efficiency gains, etc. Tax efficiency gains was a big surprise at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, that most analysts sort of didn't see coming. But even so, it's about growth in the end. And if you look at government finances, big picture here, we're looking at total expenditure, total revenue, which obviously would include mostly tax revenue, and then of course the consolidated budget deficit, all of this expressed as a percentage of GDP. The teal colored line, or if you're colorblind like me, I see green or blue or something. That line that you see there, total expenditure, that's in my mind is the focus point. It's sort of taking up somewhere between 35-40% of GDP, of a shrinking cake. That doesn't make sense. Let's go back to the end 1990s, mid 2000s, when government, National Treasury in particular, made it very clear that they wanted to keep total government expenditure to somewhere around 25% of GDP. And they've managed that, and it helped them, apart from tax efficiency gains and stronger growth, to actually sort of eventually move out away from those big budget deficits and printing small surpluses. Then we had the crisis, we know that. We had to spend more, no doubt about that. But since then, we just couldn't get expenditure back to levels closer to around 25 as opposed to 30%. And that's the point here. So your deficits are not going to get smaller than a rule of thumb of around 3%. And in the process, you're accumulating debt A better way of looking at that to see sort of the true impact on sustainability is probably by looking at the primary balance, which is the consolidated budget balance, as most of you know on the previous chart, excluding interest payments on your debt load. You want to run a primary surplus. You do not want a primary deficit. So since the global financial crisis, we've been running on a consistent basis negative primary balances, which imply, as Stefan indicated, the few minutes he sort of had at his disposal, is that government is effectively borrowing money to service its debt. Now, if it's a small sort of number, I think you can sort of get away with it. If your debt to GDP ratio is still on the low side, you can also sort of like manage that. Most countries are in a position like this globally, that's true, but I'm worried about South Africa. I'm not worried about the United States. So this is an issue. And if we don't get this line close to zero, you're going to see the impact on your debt load. And it's already showing. If you look at the next chart where we're showing your public sector debt, again, as a percentage of GDP, and it's now sort of heading to levels around 90%. So those are estimates right at the end. I don't want to make too much of those. Those are forecasts. I think I want to focus on the following. Going back to 1993, when that Reserve Bank paper was written, we were concerned about the possibility of the debt trap and debt standing at around 50% of GDP. All those factors we mentioned assisted us in sort of like reducing that debt load to a much more sustainable level, about 25%, the good old days, where the curve actually sort of inverted. You know, you were forced to buy long-dated bonds at yields lower than that of short-dated bonds because the market saw this coming. And I remember I had discussions with Phakamani Adebe, which at that point headed up National Treasury, and begging him to please issue more long-dated debt, and Phakamani telling me that I don't need to do that, dude. I'm buying back debt. That's what I'm doing because we want to reduce debt load. Wonderful. Since then, it's sort of like headed north, and the problem with this is now, with that primary deficit, the speed at which you're accumulating debt is increasing, and that I think is the concern. So the slope of this is getting steeper, and we're very worried about that. So how do you get out of this? You need to get economic growth to accelerate. You need to cut current government expenditure significantly now in October, not later, not making any promises. And please don't bank on high inflation to inflate yourself out of this problem. It only ends in tears. So it's very important. So I know we're a small open economy. I know we have an issue with global growth. It's true, but we also know that we have structural weaknesses in SA forcing us into this low growth trap. And that's what we need to focus on. We have control over that. We do not have control over anything that happens offshore. We know why we're sitting in that low growth trap. We know we're battling with macro policy uncertainty, weak policy implementation, low levels of fixed capital investment, and a very, very rigid labor market. And apart from that, skill development issues, et cetera, et cetera. So a host of things. None of this are new to any of you, I know, and I'm probably sort of like repeating myself here. But getting back to the problem child here, it's government expenditure. And just three things I want to highlight here. We're looking at the composition of consolidated government spending, broad picture. The first is the massive imbalance between current expenditure and capital expenditure. Capital expenditure only taking up around 8% of the total budget. It's too small. You're just not going to be able to sort of get SA out of this low growth trap if you don't invest in infrastructure. And the problem with this is that it's the easier way out. If you're concerned about your budget balance and you need to cut back urgently and quickly, you tend to sort of target capital because it's politically less sensitive, and it's not the way to go. It's not sustainable. We want to go back to levels closer to 12-15%, and obviously ensure that capital is sort of like allocated efficiently. The second point here is that interest bill of yours is now sitting at over 12%. In 2007, 2008, it was closer to around 7.4%, if I remember correctly. So as your debt load increases because you have a mismatch between total expenditure and total revenue, i.e. a primary deficit as opposed to be a surplus or just the neutral number, this is going to increase. And this was like one of those issues on government's menu at the end of the 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, is to reduce interest cost. And the only way to reduce interest cost is to cut your budget deficit and, of course, borrow less from the market. The third one is an old one. The wage bill is now sitting at 33% of total expenditures. It used to be higher than that, so at least there's some improvement. But yes, I know government sort of employed more people, and that's one thing. But I mean, we also know what's happened to wages and salaries in the public sector. We just did an exercise going back to 2003, 2004. We used that as our base, used actual sort of like CPI, the brown line. That is where the wage bill would have been if wages and salaries were only sort of adjusted by actual CPI. That's not the case. The actual reality sort of states a very different picture. So organized labor clearly servicing its members really, really well, but it comes at a terrible cost. It is not sustainable. I mean, going back to the previous slide, 33% of total expenditure and 2% of the country's total population now taking up more than 50% of total tax revenue. I mean, this is not sustainable. This is one of those difficult things, and we all talked about it. And I know it's nothing new, but it needs to be fixed. So where does it leave us in terms of our sort of total picture? We sort of like simplicity in our lives. So we like to have a single number. So what we did here, we sort of created our own fiscal strength score. The way we would look at most of those things, for instance, the yield curve and what stocks we like and this and that. But in this case, looking at 8 explanatory variables, most of them obviously tied to the fiscus. 5 is a great score. Look at that 4, mid-2000s. No wonder we had sort of investment grade ratings on the sovereign side from all 3 the main credit rating agencies. And since then, just going south. And that's why we've lost those investment ratings down into non-investment, below 2% at the moment, according to us. If we look at our own sort of like score or assumptions or estimates of the way forward, and it effectively, if you want to sort of convert that into a probability of whether you're in a debt trap situation, it's probably close to around 60% now. So it's a lot more than way over 50%. So again, the trend wouldn't come as a surprise. And it's something that need to be fixed. Anything going our way? Of course. I think, like, if you look at the composition of outstanding debt, National Treasury, especially since the mid 1990s, has done really well in terms of liability management. We always wanted to avoid the mistakes made by many other emerging markets, depending too much on foreign markets. So our foreign or exposure to foreign denominated debt is low, is around 10-12% or so of total. So your exposure to currency volatility and all the other terrible things, it's low. So we're not Argentina. We don't have to run to the IMF. We wrote a paper, I think it was end of 2018 or so, where we stated why we think South Africa at that point didn't need to go to the IMF, because we got a deep, liquid local market. And even in that, the local issuance government's also doing a really terrific job, National Treasury in particular, by sort of like limiting their exposure to short-dated or treasury bills, so that rollover risk, the redemption risk, is kept relatively low. And within those fixed rate nominal bond and inflation link bond components, they always tended to issue long dated as opposed to short dated, obviously to sort of push out those maturities. Redemption risk is kept low. We've seen sort of like things turning for the worse the last few months because of clearly market conditions until about 3 months ago or so, when National Treasury issuing more treasury bills, and they tended to roll down the IRB and nominal curves as well because of the steepness of those curves, and obviously reduced demand for long-dated instruments, because I think most in the market like us are concerned about fiscal slippage. So, but it's not like the end of the world yet. It's not making a huge difference, but it's certainly something that's being flagged. But in the end, it's not looking too bad in terms of sort of like that. And that's why we, there's a difference between sort of being concerned about the public sector debt trap and the risk of default. Default becomes a big issue when you sort of run into redemption risk, and that's not something that we're too concerned about at the moment. So in terms of funding cost, there's no way around this. Your market yields are not only determined by government or supply by government. We know that. There are a lot of other factors that play as well. But if you look at this debt to GDP ratio that we've been talking about, and the link to the steepness of the curve, there's a strong correlation. Again, it's not the only driver. A lot of other drivers as well. The SARB, for instance, are doing really a really great sort of job by being consistent with policy and doing the right things for the right reasons. So that clearly helps as well. But if we go back to the debt to GDP ratio, it clearly implies here that there's going to be upward pressure on yields, and it's already happened. What we're using here as an indicator of the yield spread, which is not perfect, but it's the best that we have for now in this sense, is looking at the spread between the 10 and 30-year fixed rate nominal bonds issued by government. And as you can see there, it's sort of like following this trend of debt to GDP rising. And it's clearly something that government will need to take into account, and they do that. Because it implies that their funding costs will be going up as well. And that's one reason why they've been rolling down the curve with new issuance as well. So in terms of key takeaways then, obviously the fiscal strength score is now at its lowest point in decades. It's not just because of sustained subtrend economic growth or that low growth trap that we referred to. It's also stronger than expected disinflationary forces. Keep in mind, I mean, these numbers are expressed as a percentage of nominal GDP. So nominal equals real GDP growth plus inflation. So, and again, the point we made earlier is that don't bang on higher inflation to bail you out. Don't do that. But it's something that obviously sort of played a role as well. The last few years, poor fiscal management in the sense that we were terrible at policy implementation, good plans at every budget, good intentions, and I can't blame National Treasury for this. They're doing what they can. It's obviously sort of like higher up where things need to be sorted in terms of macro policy, getting all those other ministries to play their part, and then we all know about the funding pressure from some of the state-owned enterprises. I'm not going to go into that. Futuregrowth has been jumping up and down about that for the last few years. And the numbers we are showing today exclude those sort of like contingent liabilities. Keep that in mind. So if any of those will crystallize, then we are obviously sort of like going to end up with a worse outcome. This outstanding debt level will lead to a rise in the cost of funding in both nominal and inflation-linked bond markets. There's no doubt about that, because government will have to tap into all those markets and will force more sovereign rating downgrades. But to me, it's more about the rise of costs, because that goes first. Rating agencies are backward-looking; they tend to follow fact. So I'm less concerned about that. I'm more concerned about the actual cost of funding. And it's easier said than done. We need to clear those obstacles to high sustainable economic growth, and we mentioned those things that need to happen. I think it's like everybody has been talking about that, and it's easy to sort of talk these things. It's more difficult to actually implement most of those things. But we need to we need to sort of reduce current expenditure significantly. That's in a way the quickest sort of solution to this problem. And as I mentioned before, let's not sort of play around with inflation. It's an easy, lazy way out, fooling around with central bank independence, etc., is something that is very, very undesirable. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Vikas. Appreciate that. I think there's a bit of an echo, but that's it. Yeah, I mean, it's not a pretty picture that you're painting. When you talk about what's working for us, also, very few sort of components in that what's working for us kind of situation. We haven't received any questions yet. To the audience, if you have a question, you can do one or two things. You can just put something in the chat box, firstly, or secondly, you can just raise your hand and raise a question that way. If I can maybe then just start with a question from my side, Vikas, while we're waiting for everybody to just wrap their heads around. I think you've scared everybody off here. Wrap their heads around what you've just shared. So, I mean, if I had to put you on the spot and ask you the question, how far are we in a debt trap? Are we in a de facto debt trap? Or how far are we from a debt trap? How would you respond to that?
Stefan, yeah, I think, as I mentioned, this deficit in terms of the budget balance where we exclude interest payments, that is telling. Now, it's probably slow. If you look at it, it's still okay, but if you look at our forecast, if you don't fix things, it's going to go back to, around somewhere between 2 and 3%. Now, it's an estimate. I do not like that. And if you sort of like throw that into our sort of fiscal score, and of course, some of the other sort of explanatory variables would sort of like refer to real capital, GDP growth and things like that. It suggests that we're probably already in that debt trap, or at least, let me rephrase that. There's a 60% probability of us being in that debt trap. You can always get out of it by fixing things. We've been here before. Many countries have been here before. But that's not the point. The point is we need to do something. We need to cut current expenditure. Don't cut capital expenditure, cut that current expenditure, because in my mind, we're there. It's a 60% probability. It's high enough to be very, very concerned.
Okay. I'm just checking the chat box. So when you say cut current expenditure, I mean, and when you look at South Africa, we're an emerging economy, country that comes from a really bad history. That you spoke about the people, those who are contributing towards tax revenue, that percentage quite small. The income disparity, obviously wide, probably the widest that you would find anywhere in the world. When you're talking about cutting expenditure, I mean, can we cut expenditure is the question. If you've got 15 million people in South Africa that are dependent on our grants, disability or income grants, etc., then where do you go? I mean, other than salaries, of course, being the obvious, but where else do you go?
Yeah, Stefan, that's a very good question, because it's easy for us to sort of say cut. And as you indicated, we have got a terrible history. And there's been a lot of things that need to be fixed still, and we're not. And that's why we sort of, you look at this chart, we're not sort of like pushing for cuts in goods and services. That's important. It's about how it's delivered. Can it be delivered more efficiently? Is the money going or channeled into where we want it to go, especially for assisting the poor, especially. That's why I don't want to make too much of the first half of this year going into the third quarter, where we have terrible sort of like consequences of this pandemic and the national lockdown to many people. I mean, we see it every day, don't we? You see it around you. It's so much worse. I think it's about all of us getting putting solutions on the table. And I really want organized labor also to sort of like look at this chart and come to the party. Do you really want to keep sort of pushing for inflation plus increases? I'm not saying we should sort of fire public servants left, right, and center. You're just going to sort of make things worse, because where do they go to? You need people to sort of like work, and you need people to earn a living. It's about this cake is getting too small. There is no way we can afford these sort of increases. The labor market is way too rigid. So this is the starting point. And I know it's one of the most difficult things to do. It's easy for me to say, because I'm not sitting in that position where I have to sort of like have discussions with labor unions on these things. But that's important, because that's where you're going to make the biggest impact. Interest payments, the other one, as we discussed as well. But we don't want to sort of like, obviously, and I think we're forced to sort of going to be spending more on social grants as well, because we need to create a safety net. It's about where do we get the money from? We can't tax more. We mentioned the negative impact of, overtaxing society in South Africa about 2-3 years ago, where we, in economic jargon, we refer to the Laffer curve effect. The more you increase taxes, the lower economic growth, the more inefficient those tax increases are. You're just not going to sort of like rake in as much money as you thought you would, because it's counterproductive. So we don't want to go there either.
Okay. Thanks for that, because Artemis, I'm not sure if you can see any questions from the audience coming through. There's a hand.
Stefan, yeah, no, I don't see anything coming through. So, but as you said, there is one. Yes, there is one here.
Yeah. Etienne Leroux.
Yeah.
Hi, guys. Hi, Vikas. Thanks for your thoughts. Thanks for your thoughts. Nice to see you after many years. I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, yes, Vikas, and I'm just going to ask you, and while I agree that the problem, or the biggest problem that the government has, sits on the spending side of the equation, but that being said, isn't cutting spending in a deep recession a bad idea?
Yeah. No, Etienne, I think, if I may sort of, of course, I think you're spot on. Stefan, Etienne is probably going to be able to answer his own question a lot better than I would be able to. I know this man.
I have an opinion.
Yes, but Etienne, that's why I said I'm sort of like, we want them to do this and that, and this is probably the only way out, but how easy is it to do? And I think a lot of countries are in a similar position. Where do you cut the spending now in a deep recession? As like the central bank, can we take the repo rate lower because of what's happening in terms of economic growth, or the fact that we sort of grow at a negative rate, and inflation is nowhere to be seen? So no, Etienne, it's a fair point to make, and I think it's just, we got to be careful here, because it's probably worse to eventually sort of find yourself at a point of no return, and then how do you turn this boat? So it's definitely sort of like, it's definitely fact is that it's easier said than done, and that's why I sort of want to go back to the wage bill thing and saying, guys, can we really afford this? Can we really afford to sort of like, we at Futuregrowth did not sort of receive any sort of salary increases this year, because we can't afford that. The bottom line sort of prevents us from doing that. So I honestly would like sort of like, the public sector sort of to sort of follow the same principle here. We cannot afford that. And that's what needs to happen. We need to sort of show that we want to sort of like try and cut where we can.
Yeah. If I may, Stefan, can I just make an additional comment, i.e., obviously on this topic, comment/question, and because you've given us your thoughts and ideas of how to get out of this fiscal hole in a way, and obviously the most ideal way is to grow yourself out of trouble, and for that you need the correct policy. But the sad reality is that even if we implement the best policy tomorrow, it's going to take 2 or 3 years for those policies to deliver the economic growth. So that's the one thing. Ideally, we would have loved to have been in a situation where we today see the dividends of good policy having been implemented 2-3 years ago already. That would have enabled us to implement some of the austerity light, because then you would have implemented austerity light at a time when the economy is actually growing and not in a recession, for argument's sake. I also agree with you on inflating your problem away is a bad idea. Debt default or restructuring obviously should be avoided. But then, interestingly enough, what about, you can grow yourself out of trouble, or you can implement austerity, but that's easier said than done. Isn't there then a situation where increasingly more emphasis is going to put on interest cost control or financial repression or various aspects related to that? It is perhaps also not ideal, but aren't we in an environment, given South Africa's dilemma, where no solution is easy, that there's probably going to be a little bit more focus and attention on financial repression to try and buy us some time? Any thoughts and ideas on that?
Yeah, I think if I may start with the financial repression, I think it's in a way probably easier for a sort of more developed market with a better sort of skill base and an ability sort of like to recover quicker, to sort of use those sort of tools, and you've seen that being used elsewhere, right? I think we're concerned about South Africa's ability to in a way not get addicted to that sort of like easier solution. You know what I mean? So we would fight that one. We would not want us to go there. We would not want us to sort of go to reflating yourself out of issues. We don't want to go to the points you made, because it to us carries significantly more risk in an emerging market, small open economy like South Africa. So again, it's about finding a solution based on many little things that we are pretty sort of starting to get right. And I think we do have a list of green flags. It's important for us to sort of keep an eye on that. There are things happening. Is it fast enough? Probably not. Is it big enough? Probably not. But things are happening. Recent sort of like noises made about, electricity supply, etc., etc. There's all sorts of things that eventually will pay out. But as you indicated quite clearly, it's not a short-term solution, it's a longer-term solution. I can take the pain for the next 2 or 3 years if I sort of have evidence that a lot of small things are happening, and it's gonna, and slowly but surely you may turn the ship. But what I don't want us to sort of do is to sort of go for those so-called easy solutions, but then, run the risk of getting stuck, because you need to address the underlying problem, don't you? And it's easier said than done. Again, we talk here, and it's easy for us to sort of like throw around ideas. It's a lot more difficult to sort of like implement those things in reality and practice.
Thanks, guys. Thanks.
Thanks, Etienne.
Thanks, Etienne. Appreciate the questions and the comments. There are always more questions than answers. I'm just having a look at time. So we've got 2 minutes left. Are we still we still use that 2 minutes there, Artemis?
You certainly can.
Fantastic. So, because comments on the last two questions from our side, I think we've got a number of treasurers from various corporates on the call, and it's great to have them here. Just maybe 1 or 2 data points from your side on interest rates going forward. Possibly not a hike, unlikely, but can we expect more cuts? If you can maybe just touch on that. And then I think a question that always comes up, our sovereign rating and the cost of capital. If you can maybe just, provide a little bit of color on how you see that play out, given the trajectory that our economy is on, which is quite poor.
Yeah, I think, Stefan, thank you. I mean, some of these guys will probably have a much better view on these things than I do, but for what it's worth, our official view at the moment is that we're happy for the short end to remain anchored. If we're wrong on that, the SARB may cut again. If we sort of talk about cuts, it's probably a 25 basis point cut or so over the next year or so. Etienne alluded to, us being in this sort of like terrible situation where we battle with the worst recession in living memory, and with muted inflation or very benign inflation outlook. Doesn't matter how you look at it, how you cut and slice this. And I think the SARB's like in a position where they can keep the rate unchanged for a year plus, and that's a sort of base of our view. If we're wrong on that, as I mentioned, maybe a small cut at some point, but it will be data dependent. They have the luxury to sort of like look at and take their cue from data. The issue to us is really the steepness of the curve, and that's where you're going to sort of see volatility at the back end, up and down. I don't want to be arrogant by saying it's only going to go one way. You can't do that. The curve has steepened quite a bit. If you look at this chart, and it is catching up with that sort of like level in terms of debt to GDP. So there's been a lot of bad news priced into the market as well. What's also great about this is the fact that we've seen foreigners selling around about 70 billion year to date. So their holding has dropped from that high of 43% May 2018 to around below 30% now. Still a lot, but those are sort of more active managers. So they see value in the market clearly. They look at SA relative to other emerging markets as well, and where they can sort of like find yield. So, and our market is fairly liquid. So short end anchored, volatility at the back end. Be careful how you invest, where you invest. We don't want to be sitting in cash. We don't like cash. We want to find the middle ground between protection against some potential capital loss, but not missing out on that yield curve slope, the carry or the running yield, or that base across. So that's why we sort of prefer to sort of invest in medium dated bonds at this point. No cash, medium dated bonds. Avoid the back end in terms of duration until we feel a bit more comfortable with us sort of finding a level of stability in terms of fiscal slippage. I don't need to sort of necessarily see the primary deficit going back to zero or into surplus territory. If it just stabilizes at these sort of levels for the right reasons, including maybe improved tax efficiency gains, then we'll feel better about the market.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks for that, Vickers. I appreciate it. So I think just from my side, we've come to the end of our webinar. Thank you very much for those that have joined. We really appreciate your time. Hopefully we didn't ruin the rest of your week. I think we're all aware of the economic situation in our country that's probably the worst it's ever been. We're going to stay on the line afterward. I'm going to hand back now to Artemis, but Vickers and myself will stay on the line. If there are any additional questions, so see this as we've just finished the presentation and we should like mulling around in the lobby. If you want to ask any additional questions, we're going to stay on for another couple of minutes, and then address those questions that you may have. Because if I could just ask you to go to the end of the presentation. There we go. You can leave it at that. Those are my contact details for anybody who would like to reach out and have a conversation. about future growth around any additional, information, interest rates, etc., and so forth, corporate cash. More than happy to take those calls. Artemis, I'm handing back to you.
Just like to thank, first of all, Vikas and Stefan. And Vikas, thank you for just giving us an insight into what is happening without all the hype of reading it in the press. It really is much more, I think, kind of, putting us more at ease rather than seeing all the headlines that really scare us. But I do say that on the eve of what is a COSATU strike looming, I believe. But anyway, let's face that as it happens. But thank you very much to Futuregrowth. Thank you for the sponsorship. Thank you for the excellent presentation. And also to all the participants. I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. And please keep in touch. At the moment, just one more thing that we have to have updated is there's our careers portal on our website. There will be shortly, by the end of the week, some positions available within the market. So goodbye from me. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right. Yeah. There's a question or a request to share the presentation. We will most certainly make it available via Artemis. Okay. I think that's it. It's just us four on the line. Okay, great, well, excellent.
Hi guys.
Thanks, guys. Do you guys want to?
Thank you very much.
Well, it's recording still, so let's talk off here if you want to.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Thanks, it went well. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye.